Thank you very, very much for being here. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's also fantastic to follow Lena Hansen's talk. I'm a huge fan of her work, obviously. And also, as it turns out, her speech earlier set up perfectly what I want to go into today. So I will be mainly focusing on the implications, but I will also be making some critical reflections both with regards to the process and also how we understand what it all means for the real world out there. So I'll talk about the way things go up and down in the agenda and what that means and what that does. I will refer specifically to desecuritization, the concept of counter-securitization that has recently been attracting attention in the literature, and I'll do that in 3 parts. First, I'll say some general things about framing. Securitization is a particular type of framing, so I want to get you to think about framing more broadly and make some connections with the crisis management literature where framing is the central element. Then I will look in specific contexts. The way I understand securitization is as a contest. There are multiple actors presenting different different projections of the world, and then there are audiences that evaluate those. And in the third part, I will make some critical reflections that relate also to my own research and experiences in academia. And this was inspired yesterday from my conversations with Andreu and some other people. So let me just introduce how I got to this field. So I am from Greece. My background is international relations. I did my PhD at the University of Edinburgh on the securitization of migration and terrorism. And I started that just before 9/11. So then terrorism comes in, the first mega crisis, what we might now refer to as macro-securitization. The whole world is shaped around that conflict, the global war on terror. So in 2010, my country, Greece, started to have a few problems. And I observed that, and I felt the need to try to understand what is going on there. So I applied for a British academic grant called I Predict a Riot. I was right. The grant was evaluated while Athens was burning in the context of bailout agreements and extreme austerity measures that were implemented in Greece during this time, in what I interpreted and I then used and connected with literature on electoral behavior and protest politics, I interpreted as a successful securitization move. I got involved with the austerity politics, and up to 2015, that was very, very exciting because the contest seemed to be live and it seemed to be potentially opening up different opportunities for Greece, for politics, for the literature, there was some excitement about also the prospect of a resolution to that crisis. This didn't turn out as good as I expected it, perhaps. Then we had another crisis, the refugee migrant crisis of 2015, and I'm using the word crisis in quotation marks because that's how they're interpreted in the literature and they're represented, but just using the word crisis in itself is a speech act and it does bring connotations. So I did a project on the Syrian refugee crisis. My team interviewed 1,500 young Syrian refugees in 3 countries, 500 in Greece, 500 in Lebanon, and 500 in the UK. And we also ran surveys of populations in these 3 countries and started to explore how we may be able to overcome the perceived antagonisms between citizens and refugees, us and them. That was the overall project ambition with an interdisciplinary team. I'll refer to some of those experiences, some things that were good and some things that were depressing in the process of being involved in this project. Then we had another crisis, a pandemic crisis, comes in. Again, I would refer to that as a case of macro-securitization. Macro-securitization is a concept that Bozen introduced in 2006, I think, indicating that everything else, every other security threat, every other issue comes below that big main focus of attention, and arguably the pandemic met that definition for a period of time anyway. And finally, the last thing to say is that I've been working with David Smith, who will give the next lecture. We, together with another team, we submitted a 10 million grant proposal called I Can Be, Identity Contests and Nation Building in Europe. This was about resolving ontological security dilemmas. And the essence of that was how we can conceptualize securitization as a process that can have a coherent core to study both how it's done and also its implications. So we're looking to understand success there, which, as Lena said in her talk, is not very well defined, not very clear, and that creates problems for the literature and for our understanding of the world. So, we've heard what securitization is. I spoke to some of you that had never heard of that concept, and I can tell you, Lena, that people thought that it was very clear, even for somebody who'd never been exposed to that. So that's fantastic. It is not about objective reality. Securitization is about perceptions, and it's about social understandings that are created through an interaction. I have been working on a paper that seeks to create a framework for success, and a new analytical framework to understand success and what it means for different people, for different actors at different types, at different times. And I will make some references to that today with 7 key takeaways that emerged from this research. But I'm happy also to share that article that took 15 years to write, because the first attempts were very unsuccessful. We couldn't complete it. And now it's under review, so happy to share that with anybody who has an interest. So, you hear about various things that are going to kill us. That is the essence of securitization in the broadest sense. Existential risk to humanity. AI is going to be a threat. China poses existential threats. Climate change is a major threat to humanity, to civilization. Climate change also may be an existential threat to the potato industry. If you're reading potatonewstoday.com, then the referent object changes. The nature of the threat is the same, climate change, but the referent object, the actor that has to be protected, what is at stake there, can vary. So that's important to keep in mind of the referent objects and the referent subjects, as I will argue afterwards. Anti-Semitism might be a threat. Of course, the pandemic was one that we all experienced it very vividly anywhere in the world, where it was an emergency. It was a national emergency that required a collective response. And all issues have the potential to be presented as a threat, and they can be contested by others who doubt either the validity of that representation or question its implications. So climate change, yes, it has been highly politicized and increasingly securitized, and arguably is now topping the agenda, but of course there are those that question that. When it comes to migration, which has been the main focus of securitization studies in terms of the empirical implications, we can see, and we've heard from Lena as well, that you can have representations of migrants as terrorists, as a threat, or you can draw more attention to the desecuritizing elements, the humanitarian elements of a process. So, maybe very quickly, can I ask you to get out your phones or your computers and answer a couple of warm-up questions that will connect the two lectures, the morning one and this one. So if you go to menti.com and enter this code, there are a couple of questions for you to answer. And I will also be able to compare your results to the responses of my students at the University of Glasgow, first-year students. So I'm quite curious to see if there are any differences there.
Can I do two?
You can do whatever you want. The audience determines whether what you do is successful or not me. Is this working? All right. So, is it working? Oh, it changed.
What's supposed to be the first question?
Oh, what happened there? Why is it not picking up? Technical support. All right. So it changed.
Yeah, we have this.
The first question disappeared.
Oh, the first question disappeared. Well, we'll go to the second question then. Do the second question. The second question that you'll see in front of you is, let me see what you see, it is asking you, oh yeah, let's back. Is that not?
No, it was like...
Maybe that was a mistake.
That's fine. Let's answer the, okay. So, do you see the question, what image comes to mind when you hear the word security? Yeah. Okay, so complete that and then we'll have another one. Crisis, soldier, the military dimension, protection, safety. Safety, council. Hospitals, oh, we're going to the more human dimension of security. Nice house with a garden. Oh, I think the referent object there might be the individual there. Drama, drama is everywhere in security. Security is drama. Crisis politics is a dramatic representation of different threats and different appropriate responses to deal with them. Privilege, oh, that's a very interesting word for this context. It indicates that security is not something that is shared equally across different places and different people. Life, danger, nations, the traditional referent object of the realism, the nation state, family, quite relevant also for Italy, given the success of Meloni with reference to family values. Oppression, again, oppression might be relevant here because security is often something that we think of others threatening us. So oppression might be something that we have to do to put them away, or oppression is something that we may be experienced to if we happen to be seen as part of the group that is inferior and or dangerous. Emancipation, a beautiful normative word about how things should be, perhaps, rather than how they are. European governments, is mentioned there, integrity, absence of threat, that's Wolfer's definition that Lena Hansen referred to. War, policing, cage. Oh, we're talking about migration, so you remembered cages. Yeah, cages. You can see that most of those words have a negative connotation. Security originally had a positive connotation. Absence of threats, sine cura. Isn't it Latin? But increasingly it became a negative concept. It reminds us of all the things that are going to be killing us. So let's do the second one, which is, I'm asking you to rate, in your perception, to what extent do you think each of the following pose an existential threat? 0, these things represent no threat. 10, they represent an existential threat. And we have a number of threats from different sectors. Military, economic, environmental, political, and societal. These are the 5 that the Copenhagen School identifies as the key sectors. Global health cuts across them and was dominant in recent years. Terrorism, I should have put in cyber as well, just to give credit to Lena for expanding and giving us a very important additional sector to this. Now you will see that what happens when we negotiate security threats is that the audience valuations and therefore the outcome of this process changes the more you participate. When there is one vote, the one person decides how things will be ranked. As more voices are inputted into this discussion, we will see the scores changing. So far we have 11 people, 12, and so far it appears the environmental threats are currently in this room at this moment in time, and based on how I set up this conversation early on, is topping the agenda. I might have influenced that. I might have primed it by saying that the environmental issues appear, in my perception, to be heading towards the top. Military threats are currently the second place. Societal threats, which migration would be an example of a societal threat, but in the examples I've put in there, I thought more of it from bottom-up, discrimination and racism, the reversal. Energy is quite low, perhaps surprisingly low. Terrorism as well is low, and global health that 2 years ago or a year and a half ago would have been the #1 issue now has dropped. Now let's compare. I will give you a copy of that. I'll take a snapshot of that and I'll share my PowerPoint, and this will include your answers so you can study them. But I'll go back to my PowerPoint and show you how my students responded to these questions in February. So this was in February. 150 first-year students participated. This was the answers that they've given. You'll see there are some overlaps. You can see some other institutions also featuring NATO, of course. In the context of February 2023, NATO was in the center of public debate, so appearing in people's understandings. These were their responses. You can see that they do share with you their ranking. It seems to me that it's quite similar. Environmental and military threats at the top. Societal threats, for whatever reason, maybe because of the audience effects, were quite low among my students, but in the context of a specialist expert group that is interested in minority rights, and the way I've asked the question, this was picked up. So security and the ordering of the security agenda is a very, very dynamic process. The answers that we would give, our perceptions, would change from time, from place, from context, from how things have been primed and how things have been asked, which brings in questions about framing. What color are these balls? Obviously, there is a trick. You should know there is a trick. They are the same color. Well done for understanding the game, not trusting your eyes. Don't trust your eyes. This is a framing effect. These balls are all brown. It's driving me insane. I kept cutting parts of this picture and superimposing it on top of the other to prove that they are the same, because I couldn't believe it. But they are. They're brown, and the framing effect makes us look at them as different colors. So framing then is about selecting some aspects of reality and drawing attention to them while ignoring other aspects of reality. So look at that, don't look at that. And that is extremely powerful because they provide us, we get lenses to interpret what is going on around us. Theories are lenses. Securitization theory provides us with a lens to study the world. Realism or feminism or human security, all of them have different lenses that we can employ. But the interesting thing in the framing literature is, which is actually much more extensive than the securitization literature, although there are obvious connections between the two. The idea is that elites manipulate to get their frames, their understanding of the world forward and have that accepted by an electorate so that they can get voted in, or so that they can attract attention, they can attract, they can increase their political legitimacy, their reputation, or other things. So elites will do everything they can to get their version of reality out there and share it with an empowering audience. And this is done by small changes on how things may be presented, specific words, setting the agenda. There are different techniques that can be used to frame things in a particular way so that the audience, when presented with a question, they can understand what this issue is. That's a problem definition. They can understand what caused it, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, who are the good guys, the bad guys, and most importantly, what should be done. What is the treatment? What is the recommendation that will come out of this frame? So framing. So I'm from Greece. I have connections, obviously, and I can import excellent Greek quality yogurt. My question to you, as my peer group, you're my focus group, I want to sell it. So how shall we sell it? Shall we sell it frozen yogurt contains 20% fat, or frozen yogurt 80% fat free? So 20% fat, raise your hands. 80% fat free? So the majority of you went for 80% fat free. Obviously, these are the same product, obviously, right? These are called equivalency frames. They are the same product, packaged in a different way, and the literature consistently shows that the 80% fat free is most likely to sell, because it involves loss aversion, and humans feel like this is a more tasty product as a result, at least in our minds. Not in the reality, but our minds shape our words. and I'll say something more about that. So these are equivalency frames. There are also issue frames. The issue frames is about how you present the topic. If we talk about the pandemic, I want you to think about people dying. Or if we talk about the pandemic, I want you to think about people losing their jobs. So all of these priming effects, issue frames can draw attention to some aspects of a situation in order to produce social understandings and responses. This is a competitive process. By its nature, it's a competitive process. Many, many actors will present different representations of the world. So the point that I want to make from this is that our threat perceptions, who we consider a friend or an enemy, whether we're willing to take risks, how even we vote, or how we behave in general in political behavior, is not always as rational as we would like it to be, or as sometimes we think we are. We think we are rational people. But it's influenced instead by how we process information. First of all, what information we're exposed to, and we're all exposed to different information. So first problem there. We're influenced by cognitive biases, we're influenced by framing effects, and this is significant for our lives, and we better be aware of it. It's very important that we are aware of it. Otherwise, we will accept uncritically the realist idea, this is the world, this is the objective reality, these are the truth, the absolute laws that exist and apply, and that's the end of the conversation, and get on with it. Nah, it doesn't work this way. So, it doesn't work this way, and I will prove it to you. With some games. So, let's do this one first. Ready? It's not going to be any sound.
How many passes does the team in white make?
Go! How many passes? 11. 13. 12. Any 11, 12, 13?
The answer is 13.
Damn! But,
did you see the moonwalking bear?
Did you see the moonwalking bear? Oh, somebody saw it. Most of you didn't, right? All right, let's have a look at the moonwalking bear. It's easy to miss something you're not looking for. This was a brilliant advert in the UK to protect cyclists, look out for cyclists, and you can see the effect. You're looking at that, and then you've missed all the reality that is happening outside. And that's important, and that happens all the time, and I have a few more games for you to try. I'm not going to do all of them now, but I'm going to do another game now.
Con Globo hai tutta la città a portata di mano. Cerchi qualcosa di diverso? Ordina un globo. Hai finito i pannolini? Ordina un globo. Il problema risolto. Con un bel film ci vuole un buon gelato. Scarica Globo e dice...
I don't know what that said. I'm sure it was good. So this is a different type of game. This is not framing. This is to get you suspicious of how your brains work.
Correct.
All right, so.
Do not adjust your television. The colors you are seeing are correct. Stare at the black dot in the center of this image. For the next few seconds, this dot is your whole world. Stare directly at the dot and don't look away. We promise you're about to see something you might find incredible. The image is about to change, but keep your eyes firmly on the dot no matter what. Ready? Do you see color? And if you move your eyes, does the image suddenly appear black and...
Did anybody see color?
Yes.
You saw color?
At the start.
You saw color at the start? So let's see, was there any color? So that was when the image changed. Make sure that we're not cheating here. There was never any color, right? There was never any color. This, you've added, your brain added information that was not there. presented with quick changing data, in terms of visual data, connecting to visual securitization perhaps even, and the brain tends to take shortcuts based on what we know, based on my assumption of what the sea should look like, based on contextual information. So, not the objective reality then. You want to do another one of those? Now you know. So there is never going to be any color. Don't let your brain add things that are not there.
This image. Are you staring at the dot? Here's a tip to make the colors appear for longer. When the image changes to black and white, make sure your eyes remain focused on the dot. Ready? Here we go. Do you see this castle in full color? Now if you move...
Did you see color? You didn't see color. You have to do it again. Keep your eyes on the black dot. Now I'm going to have to do it again just for you. So, focus on the dot. Don't move your eyes. Are you ready? This is just for you.
Do you see this castle in full color?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Now move your eyes on the dot. Ready? Here we go. Do you see this castle in full?
Yeah, the longer you keep your eyes on the dot and not move away and correct the false information that your brain added, the longer you will have an inaccurate representation of the world. I have a few more games for you to try. Some of them are fun. Framing is everywhere and it's never, not necessarily intentional anyway. It's just a normal feature of reality. Here is a map of the world. We're familiar with this representation. Do you see anything particularly wrong with this representation of the world? Well, yeah, so exactly. So in this representation that is used in Google Maps and all the navigation systems, you can see that Africa appears on the one side to be the same size almost as Antarctica, when in fact it's 14 times bigger. And the actual size of some of those countries are not what appears in the standard map. So, with this, I made the connections in this article with crisis management, and in that we understand crisis in the traditional sense as something that happens, so there's a surprising thing or a sudden event, but then it's not enough, the material aspect is not enough. How we think about it, the social understandings and perceptions around it, and the dominant narratives around crisis is what actually determines what will happen during and after a crisis. So the key literature there shows that the main currency of crisis management, other than pure coercion, is persuasion. So persuasion is important there, and then these narratives, the literature says, and it fits perfectly with securitization research, develop framing contests, they call them, about the nature and severity of a crisis, its causes, the responsibility, blame for its occurrence or escalation, and the appropriate remedy. So you can see that this fits perfectly with securitization research. The first question is what we would call in securitization language the stage of identification. What is this? How serious is it? How severe is it? The second question, which doesn't feature so much prominently in securitization literature, but is there, is questions about blame. Who is to blame for that? What caused it? What's going on there? That's important because it also has an impact on then what should be done. Because sometimes if you blame Greece for the bad economic situation in 2010, well, punish them. It's their fault. Let them die. So blame is an important mediating question, in my opinion, to understand securitization. And the third, which is the main part that I want to talk about, is what should be done, the stage of mobilization, which then produces implications. So, going then to securitization theory, we've heard from the first talk, we have a Bible, a new framework for analysis. The Copenhagen School tries to expand, but not all the way to make it impossible to study. So they reject the idea that the individual might be a referent object, but they talk about survival of referent objects, and we've talked about those 5 key sectors originally, and this is expanding, and now we have cross-sectoral threats as well, like health and energy. Here is some representations and referent objects associated with migration. Migration is associated with, there's a criminal migrant thesis, or threat to criminality, threat to the economy, they take our jobs. But the essential element of it is that migration and minorities and others are a threat to our identity, our language, our way of life, and this is used particularly from parties on the far right to achieve electoral success. I will come back to that. So the process, as we've heard, is about language. This is the Speech Act. Lena referred to the priest pronouncing somebody, husband and wife or whatever. That is the act, saying something is done. So language is central, according to the Copenhagen School. Repetition, signaling, euphemisms, all of this can have a big impact. Here is a headline I picked up in the news a couple of years ago on the BBC. Hurricane Laura will cause unsurvivable storm surge. I really, really like that because I've never seen the word unsurvivable before. I thought that's, at least give us a chance, you know, give us a, make it a, you know, unsurvivable, that sounds fatalistic. But it was really very, really good. Plus I clicked on it, so that worked. I checked afterwards. Nobody died. This was a press release by some experts, meteorological organization in the US, picked up by international media. The word unsurvivable, of course, is a nice way to attract attention. The realities and the perceptions and the headlines don't necessarily match. And of course, it's not just words, it's practices. Crucially, it's configurations, it's power structures, it's monuments, it's images, it's laws. These are all associated with the Paris School of Securitization, more sociological take on that, and complement the focus on languages. And the walls, for instance, is the standard way to present migration as an external threat. In terms of the actors, according to the Copenhagen School, anybody can be a securitizing actor, anybody, and therefore anybody can be a desecuritizing actor. But in reality, security is a hierarchical field. Some people are considered more legitimate to write legitimate security discourses. They have the authority, they have the access to a microphone, they've got the reputation or the titles, and therefore the Copenhagen School concludes, and the evidence supports that securitization as a process tends to be top-down. The media, that's interesting to note, according to the original formulation of the Copenhagen School, the media is not an independent securitizing actor. It is a functional actor. It popularizes, it amplifies the message of political elites and security professionals that are the dominant actors. But I'm not sure I'm buying this, at least not anymore with social media and with incredible weaponization of media across the world. Who can access what channel now has become part of global politics. So I don't know if the media is just a functional actor or whether we need to better attention to how the media plays an independent role in the securitization process. And certainly I don't agree with the original idea of the Copenhagen School that it's only top-down, and we've seen many examples where securitizations come from individuals or supported by prominent individuals that do have access to the media, so let's accept that, or the experts or even celebrities can come in sometimes to good or bad effect. And of course, international organizations on the pandemic, the World Health Organization, the day that the World Health Organization used the Speech Act, pandemic, the world changed. So words are powerful. That was a start. So from all of this, in this this article that was part of the I Can Be project, and I will continue working with David to explore how securitization contests and identity contests work out. They have 7 key takeaways, and I'll mention the 3 first ones that are related to the process. So the first one is to say, if we want to understand what securitization is and does, we have to account for both languages and practices. So we have to include both the Copenhagen School insights and the Paris School insights. If you do one or the other, you have an incomplete picture. So we have to move forward together. That's the first takeaway after engaging with very complicated literatures. The second takeaway, which came up in the previous presentation, is about the nature of the measures. Do they have to be emergency measures, what is really, how do we know an emergency measure when we see it? How do we specify that? Well, we don't take a position on that. The Copenhagen School talks about the need for emergency measures. The Paris School says it's not about emergency measures. It can be routines, very, very gradually changes that configure understandings and structures and organizations, not 0 to 100 change. We don't want to take a position on whether they have to be emergency measures or not, but we do have to take a position and understand that there are different effects if the securitization measures, the emergency measures or any measures have been permitted but not yet taken. For instance, in some cases we have the understanding that environmental issues are a threat, but there is no mobilization around them. There is a difference if these measures have been permitted and taken, that indicates something much more complete about the process, or if they have been outright rejected. So we have to keep this in mind. The third takeaway from the process side of things is that we cannot ignore the audience. Now, I say this because some of the securitization literature did try to cut away the role of the audience. Even the Copenhagen School, in its original formulation, had a little bit of contradictions about it. Initially, they referred to the process as self-referential. You say something and something is done. Nah, that is not actually what they say later or how things work. Securitization is intersubjective. It's about shared understandings between those that present something as a threat and those that evaluate empowering audiences. And we have to keep the audience within our framework to achieve the securitization as a social process, the way I understand it. There were some attempts by Rita Floyd in particular to refer to experts and create some specific criteria about what is just and unjust securitization. I have a problem with this because I think that the audience has to be part of the framework for it to retain its purpose. And the other thing to say about the audience is that what the audience evaluates is not a single thing. It's not enough to say whether something is a threat. That is a serious question, and it's an important question, but I've mentioned from the crisis literature, there's two other questions, blame questions, and more importantly, questions about the stage of mobilization. Okay, so this is a threat. What should we do about it? These are two different questions. It's not automatic. Just because Greece has an economic crisis and owes money to everybody, it's not automatic then that austerity is the right response to that. These are two different evaluations. But the way it happens in reality is you present a threat and then the audience accepts everything or can accept everything that is then offered as the solution to that immediate danger. And there are always multiple audiences. I think it's useful for our purposes when we do securitization research to separate between moral support, which for instance might be the general public, and formal support, which is for instance the legislature, the government, that actually decides whether to go to, whether to implement emergency measures or not. These two are separate to each other. Sometimes governments implement laws that the general public rejects. And we see that in the case of migration in some countries, or the case of Iraq war, for instance, which we participated in 2003. And the UK at the time in 2003, I recall, was against an intervention. The public, at least the moral audience, was against an intervention. There were big protests. 1.5 million people, I think, participated in protests against the Iraq war. But then there was this headline that made the news, that Saddam Hussein has the ability to attack the UK within 45 minutes. Which is amazing, because 45 minutes is not even enough to finish a full episode on Netflix. So it's very immediate, you know. It's not just urgent, you know. It has the essence of urgency, and therefore, since I only have 45 minutes, you know, I'm not going to go and evaluate the evidence. I have 45 minutes. Just tell me what to do, and let's go and get him. So we have 45 minutes to go and get to do something, to intervene, to act before it's too late. That's the idea. And there is also an element there called the precautionary principle. We don't have to wait for all the evidence in the face of an existential threat, because then it would be too late. We have to act early. And there is a logic to that, but also there is a danger to that. I can tell you afterwards the background to this 45-minute claim, because I spoke to the guy that implemented it. So let's move to the implications. Now, already we heard about the implications that the democratic processes can be suspended. There are many negative consequences that can come out of it. And there are facilitating conditions as to whether a securitization or desecuritization attempt will be accepted or rejected. The context is paramount. The same language, the same message might not work in Greece or in Italy or in the UK or in Rwanda at different times in different places. So the immediate effects is urgency, it's prioritization, it's the top of the agenda, and it's more resources. So prioritization. During the pandemic in Glasgow, where I stay, during the first lockdown, some teenagers next to our house, to our estate, gathered together. Of course, they had enough, and they started to put loud music, started fires, and they were having a party, which is kind of, I understand that from a human perspective, but they had fires next to where there are houses. So we called the police and said, you know what, there's fires next to houses, so this can get out of hand. This is potentially a problem. And they told us, the police told us, we have been told to only respond to issues that relate to social distancing. We're only responding to things that relate to the pandemic. We cannot do anything about the fire next to your house. All right, they're not wearing masks. Okay, we're coming. I mean, that is insane, right? But it shows you how the reality can be distorted if we set agendas and allocate all attention to certain things while ignoring others. That can be really problematic. And I don't blame the police guy that answered the phone and said that we don't have the authority to do that. He's a security professional that is doing their job. But it's not logical to me. Yet, we can also think that securitization might be seen as something that is attractive. If I can scare you, I can get away with anything. I like that. You won't ask me any questions. You'll allow me to do what I want to do anyway. You'll be pacified. And also maybe I actually want to do a good job. We have a pandemic, we have a crisis. I want to do a good job. I consider myself a good guy. And in my opinion, creating walls is the right thing to do, or enforcing masks or whatever. So there might be some attraction to securitization if you have the opportunity to do it, and that might be problematic. We have reasons to question how rational securitization is, and also how beneficial it is even for the actors that pursue it. So in our framework, we want to challenge this idea that securitization is a free-for-all. You securitize and you gain something, power, reputation, resources. If that was the case, that would be a problem. And I mean, because there is a perception that this is the case, everybody's competing. No, my threat is bigger than yours. This has to go up. That's not going to work very well in a democracy, certainly, where there has to be normal rules, there has to be deliberation, there has to be accountability, there have to be human rights. All of this can potentially be compromised. But again, if I'm running Greece in 2011 and my country is bankrupt, I don't want you to be thinking, and we have elections in 2012, I don't want you to be thinking of the economic issues. I want you to be thinking of the migrants. And that's what the Socialist Party, while in coalition government, did with the Conservative Party in Greece in 2012, just before elections, after having implemented austerity that people were against, massively against. They started a big campaign drawing attention to migrant prostitutes with HIV and that was a big campaign of big attention. They've built a wall in the north. Turns out, again, these people that were drawing the media attention, they were not even migrant, they were Greek. The way they were treated was inhumane, it was insane. The individual, it was just, there was no dignity to any of that. And this was coming also from a left party. I understand from the right, but I don't understand it from the left. We have framing contests then. Everybody is presenting different things based on their understanding of the reality and perhaps based on their understanding of how they can get benefits or electoral success. Usually they get it wrong. Certainly the left that tries to compete with the right on who can be stronger on restricting immigration, like the Labour Party did in 2010 elections. They came out with a MAG, you want controls on immigration, vote Labour. That is a bad strategy. And it backfires because it moves the whole conversation to the right. So, and then the ones that benefit are the far-right parties. All of it has us versus them dynamics. Securitization creates groups and creates an us that is amazing and wonderful potentially, but certainly creates another that they are bad, they're inferior, they're dangerous. You can see that very clearly in the case of migration or other threats where the other is easier to identify, but also you can see it in cases where there is no clear other, like the pandemic. The us and them were those that followed the measures and those that didn't. Again, we have a creation of identity groups that follow this idea. So desecuritization is going back to normal politics. So the Copenhagen School says all securitizations are the failure of normal politics, which is true. If you think about it, if I'm prepared to deal with an issue, then I can, when something happens, I have the resources, the process, I know what I can stay calm and deal with it. That's great. If I'm not prepared, I have to go to the emergency mode. Sometimes this might be inevitable. Somebody invades your country. What are you going to do? You have to deal with that. So there are some cases where securitization and going to the emergency mode might be indeed necessary, but in many other cases, if we have good politics, we don't need securitization. So the Copenhagen School concludes that the ideal, they say, the ideal is desecuritization. I have a problem with that too, because we'll find out that sometimes desecuritization might not always be bad. Desecuritization might not always be good, and securitization might not always be bad. I'll come back to that. So how do we do desecuritization? Hansen's article in 2012 sets up some strategies. We'll come back to that with reference to the pandemic to give you examples, but roughly we could talk about an objectivist approach where something has been stabilized. Okay, now we had the problem, now we've solved this, here's the evidence, no more people are dying from the pandemic, problem solved. We have the possibility of replacement or substitution. Okay, this is a problem, but well, we'll have a bigger problem now, focus on that. So the agenda then is reordered because something else has dominated attention. We can re-articulate, we can reframe away from us versus them. For instance, in the case of migration, a lot of migrant protests, and I'll have an example later, don't talk about migrants versus citizens. They talk about across gender, across labor, across class characteristics, and they challenge the division of us and versus them based on citizenship status, but instead they create human commonalities that cut across nations. And that is very, very powerful potentially for transnational activism. Silencing can be used very, very decisively to securitize by excluding those that can have the right or the ability to express their needs, their insecurities, their voices, but also perhaps removing the repetition of this is a threat, this is a threat, this is a threat might also help us move away from an idea that our world is falling apart. Counter-securitization is a concept that highlights that the response might be worse than the threat. I will return to that. Other things in the traditional literature of realism, we talk about deterrence during the Cold War. Maybe deterrence by denial is a bit that I find more interesting myself. There is deterrence by punishment, and there is deterrence by denial. By denial, the deterrence is that, okay, so there are problems, but I'm strong, I know karate, I can take care of myself, so there are threats that exist, but that's fine. There is racism, there is violence, there is all of these things, there is viruses, but now we have some immunity, we've been exposed to all of this, and we know how to deal with them. Humor is something that I personally bring in my life to survive. Overall, agency is important, not accepting what you're told about anything, believing in or trusting your critical thinking, which you have to develop. It doesn't happen by osmosis, and paying attention to the competitive processes. Any questions so far before I move to the last part? No. Yes?
Will you refer to the counter-securitization?
Okay, so counter-securitization, we're exactly on the right point, thank you. So counter-securitization is a strategy that is used to challenge the original securitization. You can reverse it, you can mirror it, you can try to block the original securitization. And one example is this. So in Greece, we had an existential threat in the economic sector, and austerity was presented as the inevitable and necessary extraordinary response, extreme austerity. So then you have the radical left party Syriza that came to power in 2015 on a promise of rolling back austerity, and they used the counter-securitization argument there, that the greatest threat is not the economic crisis. The greatest threat is the austerity. So the greatest threat is not terrorism. The greatest threat is the limitations to our civil liberties. Same thing for the pandemic. You can counter-securitize by changing the referent object. The greatest threat is not, the pandemic is not just a threat to human lives. It's a threat to the economy or to freedoms or anything else. So counter-securitization is a competitive securitization process. The Syriza government was very successful in promoting that in 2015. Got electoral support, got public, got protest, convinced there was a referendum in July 2015 where the Greek citizens rejected a third bailout and austerity. But then a week later, that same government signed the third bailout, ignored the public vote, which ignored the public preferences that it had told the public to go for. So it becomes a little bit complicated, and I can explain to you why. Just to continue with counter-securitization, we've developed we've built on previous work, and we've developed that concept with Ian Patterson in that article that looks at migration politics. And the first thing to say is that specifically for migration, and perhaps maybe for other threats as well, identity is something very, very, very important, the most important element of all of this. So you can see in this graph that based on some data that we gathered, British people that consider sailing British customs and traditions, if they think that it's very, very important, the more important they think sharing British customs is, the more likely they are to be concerned rather than concern over immigration. So there is an element about how we negotiate not just our self-identity, but also how we negotiate change, which is constant and inevitable, how we negotiate anxiety about all the changes, and how we negotiate otherness, which Georgia asked us to talk about yesterday in the icebreaker. So there are some things that come out of this, and one thing to say is that in this article, the way we talked about counter-securitization, in that we looked at other political elites and religious actors that questioned the idea that migrants are a threat to British identity. Instead, they changed the referent object and said, the real threat is not migration, the real threat is us being intolerant. Our identity as British is that we're tolerant people. This is our identity. So, if our identity, the reference actually in this case is the same. We are British, so therefore we are tolerant, so those people that are racist and intolerant are the real threat. You can see then this is a counter-securitization dynamic. But, very, very important to highlight that this is not a form of desecuritization. This is not desecuritization. There is still the idea that something is a threat. There is still an enemy other. In the case of identities, we all have identities, overlapping identities, and we cannot escape our identities. We will always have some form of identity. But what happens in this case is the goalposts are moved. It's no longer us versus them, citizens versus migrants. In this kind of context, where the identity of a place is redefined or questioned by other actors within it, legitimate actors within it, we see a move from good citizens versus bad migrants to good citizens versus bad citizens. So that's still a contest, an identity contest that happens within states, and it doesn't follow the typical idea that threats are external. So migrants are an easier target because they're easier to identify as an external threat. But here, we still have securitization, competitive securitization that's happening within a state. And in relation to that, I wanted to introduce to you a concept that I think will dominate academia in the next 10 years, and it's called affective polarization. This is a concept that has emerged over the last 10 years in the US environment, and it concerns partisan identities in the US. So what this shows is that increasingly the gap between us, the party that we like, and others, the party we don't like, has been widening. And that's not because we like our party more over time. That doesn't change. But it's that we increasingly hate the other partisan identity more and more. So that's clear. You can see that in the US economy, it's been ridiculous. US politics has been ridiculous. It's recorded, right? Okay. So I can say that. High polarization, which is affective polarization, is also, the literature is very clear, is a threat to democracy, it's a threat to logic, it compromises rationality, and it's not only partisan. That is the point that I wanted to come to. All identities are socially constructed, and different identities can compete. And we're increasingly becoming fragmented as societies. Different identity groups. It's not only left, right. What does this mean anymore? It's become there are multiple issues that divide societies. Brexit, what is the threat? Staying in the EU or leaving the EU? Competitive counter-securitizations. What about other issues that are coming from the bottom up, that have attracted attention, that were not necessarily presented by political elites as a top issue? What about discrimination, LGBTQ issues, the environment? Many, many other issues are emerging in the agenda, many of them from the bottom up, and compete. So now we have competition, both from the top down, and the elites still have the top hand. They have the ability to control narratives at the start of a crisis, but not indefinitely. In a globalized world, we're influenced by what's happening elsewhere that we hear about, because we don't hear about everything that's happening that is important. So we have to be aware of that too. So this was another project that we did in 2011. There was a hunger strike in Greece. 300 migrants occupied the law school and another building, and they started a hunger strike that lasted for 44 days. It was highly politicized. It became a focal point where parties of the right and the government were trying to end that because they didn't want to progress with having to respond to questions about how coherent the immigration policy in Greece was, which it wasn't. But then parties of the left worked and contributed to the organization of the hunger strike again, and there was some civil society engagement in these issues. Now, there's a couple of things that I find interesting about this. The supporters of the hunger strikers, the parties of the left, civil society, but also the critics of the hunger strikers, they kept referring to them as these desperate, dissolute, they have nothing to live for, and they're oh, that's the last dying effort. I felt that this was all kind of Orientalist. Oh, they were saying that they're not speaking for themselves. It's the left that is controlling the hunger strikers, and they are just pawns in a political game to win votes. But both opponents and supporters were treating the migrant strikers as if they lacked agency. And that I find is very, very problematic. Because increasingly, and that's a key part of the I Can Be project with David, increasingly we see that reference subjects, the threatening and inferior others, are themselves security-seeking agents, entities. They want to be secure. They develop agency, both for their physical and ontological security. And in our research in this paper, we saw that they do that in a very smart way. They re-articulate who they are, who they speak for. They make connections transnationally and within the state. They make it very clear that this is not an act of desperation. This is a rational political act. And in fact, we interviewed 52 of those hunger strikers and ran some data analysis, and we find out that those that are driven by extreme rationality. I know I'm going to die, or there's a good chance I'm going to die during a hunger strike, but I would do it again because I believe in this cause so much. So extreme rationality is predicting future immobilization in radical protest, not desperation or any other emotion. So emotions are there, but I think the main point from this I want you to remember is that reference subjects are not passive victims in all of these processes. They are potentially, and I think rightly, security-seeking agents on their own right. So, then we've done some work on the Syrian refugee issues, and what this brings out again is how important labeling is. Labeling, categorical fetishism, it's referred to in the literature. We're obsessed to create labels, to create identities, and then not deal with the individual or the human anymore, just deal with the representation of the group that relates to that label, which is dehumanizing potentially. So what the UK did at the time was it had a two-tier system of international protection. Refugees that arrived through the asylum route, going through Aegean, the usual route, and entering the UK and applying for asylum on arrival, they were denied rights and services that those that followed the resettlement route were given access to. And so there were different labels associated to the good and the bad refugees. Some were good, and some were bad, and they were living in the same street. So there's nothing different about the individual, but because of their mode of transport, they were considered good or bad. And there's obviously a high level and degree of commodification of migration, where migration and refugees are used to promote national or other interests. And we actually argued, and we went to the Westminster and presented findings in the all parliamentary groups on migrations and skills and refugees, and told them how to build common ground. We told them how we said refugees and citizens are sharing the same ethical perspectives. We talked about skills. We also showed them the results of an experiment which we conducted at the time, the question was, what type of migrants do the citizens want? And we defined from this experiment, which I've never published because I got annoyed with what happened afterwards, I'll tell you, that citizens want high skills, fair, fine. Actually, for Syrian refugees, that was perfect because the Syrian refugees that we interviewed had very high skills, so they matched that profile. They had a preference for those that are forcibly displaced rather than economic migrants, and they had a preference for single people, which again to me says that the UK citizens, certainly at the time, were more interested in cost-benefit calculations of immigration. We want people to come with high skills and contribute, but don't bring your family and we have to pay for them, you know, because that's an extra cost to us. Other things that we asked didn't have an impact. So we presented these things. This is based on data that we collected in November 2017. We presented that in March 2019, and a few months later in February, the UK system, the UK government, who listened to our presentations and our call for normative turn, did the exact opposite. They did come up with a point system that did reflect this. So if you have a PhD, you get points. If you were in STEM, you get points. But they ignored everything else. Everything else was ignored. Anything that had to do with moral or normative arguments, or logical even arguments, they were ignored. And we suggested that they model the system of asylum support in the UK to the resettlement route, and they did the exact opposite. They moved on with further creating one-tier system, effectively, where deals with migration as an offshore problem to Rwanda, which is again polarizing. Tina, have you heard of Tina? Tina Fey? Tina Turner, we've lost her. Simply the best. But the one TINA that matters more than anything else in securitization research is Margaret. Well, there is no alternative. This is a concept that goes back to Margaret Thatcher's politics. There is no alternative. There is nothing we can do. That is the most persuasive argument ever if you want to securitize or do anything really. So we've done some, in 2015 I was involved with the austerity things, so we recorded and we found how powerful TINA is in influencing protest and voting behavior in Greece. And then we also noticed, analyzing the discourse of the Syriza Radical Left Party, they presented what I called at the time Tara. There are realistic alternatives. I couldn't find a person, I haven't published this, but Tara Reid was an actress that was famous at that time, disappeared, didn't do very well. Also Syriza's ideas didn't work very well. I mean, if you look at them now, how realistic was ever that Germany would pay reparations for the Second World War to Greece? Or that the debt will be renegotiated and deleted. These were not things that rationally would have a very good chance of working, but the campaign was run on emotions, hope, change. It worked, got the public in the streets. We were so happy, happiest time ever, until Syriza, after he told people to vote against the third bailout, a week later accepted the bailout and said, actually, TINA, there is no alternative. A week after we convinced you we can challenge all of this, we found out we can't, but we're going to do TINA, but we're going to do better than the other guys. That was the hook. So, finally, I'm going to give you some quick data from my pandemic project. This is how this data was collected on week 3 of the lockdown in the UK, April, and then it was published in this article, April 2021. I have not published this. But what I wanted you to see here is how much the UK, 3 weeks after the lockdown started, was prepared to accept extraordinary measures, including measures that had not even been discussed at the time. We asked them if they would be willing to make COVID-19 compulsory vaccinations. They were in favor of that. Social distancing, the lockdown was supported by 85% of the population. This is a representative sample of 2,500 people. And then we asked them also to evaluate how much they agree with different key frames that were presented at the time in political discourse. We derived these frames through thematic analysis, and you can see that a lot of people thought that the measures are unfair. This has no impact on attitudes. We've checked that with austerity and with the pandemic and even with migration. The normative arguments don't work very well to influence political behavior. Then there was a fatalism claim early on by Boris Johnson. There's nothing anybody can do to contain the spread of the coronavirus, so we might as well take it on the cheek. This has an impact. If you accept the fatalistic claim, then you don't support measures. The crisis opportunity frame is a common one in the crisis literature. That has an impact. You can influence people by motivating them to support collective goods. This is a fairness argument, no impact. TINA is the most important one. TINA. Everybody agreed at the time that the measures were necessary. And not only that, but if we run regressions, which is what we did, you will see, this is just to explain, this is a regression model. If a variable is touching the red line, it's not significant. If it is not touching it, it predicts that this variable people would support the social distancing measures, stay at home, or if here they would reject them. So look at the strength of TINA. TINA is by far the most important variable and strongest, by far the strongest predictor on whether people will support the lockdown on both waves that we've run the analysis. And there are other things that come out of that maybe we'll come back later. Desecuritization attempt that happened a year later or 2 years later could be seen in discourse as the objectivist. Okay, Omicron is not so bad. Could it involve rearticulation? Okay, it's not a pandemic, now it's endemic. The responsibility, blame avoidance games can come into that. You could have counter-securitization, not only going on the two mentioned, the ones that I mentioned, economy versus health, health versus civil liberties, but also health versus health. During the pandemic, okay, we dealt with this, but then more people are dying from cancer now. So, but the most important way things become desecuritized as perhaps is the case for the pandemic, is through substitution. We just stopped talking about it for a little while. For about a week, we were talking about Partygate, the fact that the Tories were breaking their own rules. And then, of course, we had the war in Ukraine, pandemic disappeared, and then the cost of living crisis. Is the pandemic over? Did we solve it? Did we learn anything from it? Or did we just move on? I don't know. Another implication of securitization in this context is, as a BMJ article, the British Medical Journal, is that we have the potential of politicization, heavy politicization. We talk about experts, but who are the experts and what experts do the government select to follow? Because the literature clearly shows that they only select the experts that will tell them what they want to hear. And then the same journal, and that annoyed me, 2 issues before that, had this article about mask wearing, and this article starts with the phrase, the precautionary principle is, according to Wikipedia, a strategy for approaching issues of potential harm when extensive scientific knowledge on the matter is lacking. Now, that annoyed me, because this kind of crap is what I would talk about. But I don't want to read about it in the BMJ. I want to read some real, rigorous data about the efficacy of masks. That's what I would prefer. But you can see that during a crisis, everything becomes sort of blurred. So, to conclude, makes little sense to decide a priori whether securitization as a process will generate good or bad outcomes for different actors at different times. This has to be studied empirically. We should always, and that's key, we should account for the relational implications of security. What it does not just for us, but also for them. And we should consider both the ontological and the physical dimension of security. We should also test that argument that securitization is always good by bringing in insights from public policy and assess the success, the programmatic and the political success for those actors that securitize or desecuritize. And always remember that securitization is not a snapshot. It happens over time. It relates to context. Historical things that happened thousands of years ago can be activated and weaponized in discourse in the right and now, as Putin did, for instance, with his essay on the tracing Russian identity. So time is important to keep in mind and to conclude. So we came up with ideal types that come out of it. I'm not going to go through that. I'll just say that there is nothing obvious about success. There is nothing obvious about how we understand what it does for different actors at different times. There is nothing obvious about how we study it. The Copenhagen School originally said the obvious method is discourse analysis. That is obviously wrong. Well, that's obviously wrong, because it's not just language, obviously, and critical discourse analysis would certainly have to be at least the one method that comes in and takes into account of power issues, or thematic analysis, or, but also methods that look at what the audience does. So I use survey evidence in my research to assess how the audience evaluates competitive messages. There are experiments that can be done to look at audience responses. There are many different methods. Also from a sociological camp, process tracing is very important for securitization. All of these things, methodological pluralism has to be accounted for. So I will end here. We do come up with some normative hierarchy in this last work that took 15 years to complete, but I will not go through that now. I'll just conclude by saying that often we suffer more in imagination than in reality. And in my website, I've put Don Quixote taking a selfie of himself as the logo, because the idea is that often, not always, but often the scariest dragons and fiercest giants turn out to be no more than windmills. And that's me. Thank you.
We still have about 10 minutes for questions before the lunch break. So if you have a question, use the microphone since we are video recording. And please say your name.
I don't have a question. I'm going to give the microphone to Tess.
Anybody? Okay, time.
I can hear you.
Can you hear me better now?
Worse.
Anyways, my question is basically a reframing of my previous question. I thought about it and it came out again. And it's about the need to include the acceptance of a message in the analysis. And mostly when we mostly talk about illocutionary acts, illocutionary acts do not need any acceptance by an audience. I mean, it's your status as a priest that makes you. I mean, it perhaps requires the choice of the audience to take part in the system of the church where declaring you bride and whatever makes you that. So yeah, I mean, like, the point is, can something be true even though it is not accepted by an audience, but it becomes true only because it is mentioned? And in this case, I mean, referring to this, then is it dependent on what you say? I mean, like, just to put it simply, if I say the same sentence, but one without not, and the other one the opposite, like meaning the opposite, am I kind of creating the same reality? I mean, you are a man, or you are not a man. Am I creating like some assumptions that both oppositive sentences refer to?
Okay.
Yeah, in relation to the neo-humanitarianism, for instance, when it comes to migration, that reinforces, perhaps in some cases at least, the victimization and all this, reinforces some securitization of the issue.
There's at least 3 or 4 very good points in what you asked. I'll try to respond if I remember all of them. So is there something real? Well, there can be real threats that are never mentioned. I mean, your research shows that there can be destruction, human rights, major threats, extinction, there can be genocide, and it can be muted. So not talking about it creates an effect, changes our reality. So if I think of 94 in Rwanda, the UN and other actors, colonial powers, didn't want to use the word genocide about what was happening. Because if you use the word genocide, then you have to do something about it. It comes with some normative baggage. You cannot say, oh, there's a genocide happening in Africa, but you can't do that. So they didn't use it there. You can see, therefore, that silencing and exclusion of voices can suppress realities, and therefore can have a huge impact on our world. So it's something doesn't become a threat because somebody says it. So if you ask me if I say something one way and another way, will that change my reality? Well, it depends on how the audience around you responds to that. You saying one thing or another by yourself in your garage will change only your mind, not necessarily change your reality. Maybe you will change how you experience the reality, but you won't change the world. Securitization, the way I understand it, involves interactions. It involves audiences responding to the various messages. And also context matters. You say one thing here in another place, it won't have the same effect, or to a different audience. So all of these things have to be taken into account. And then you said something else about, I think the way I heard it was about normative dilemmas. You say something with the intention of doing something else. I say that not all migrants are terrorists. And that can have the opposite effect, because I'm now talking about migration and terrorism as a continuum, as if it's the same topic, as if it's not possible to talk about migration outside the idea that this is a threat. So that actually, although I'm intending to desecuritize, I am securitizing. Or if I say, don't panic! I said don't panic, why are you doing like that? My words told you not to panic, you panic. Why? What's going on here? Listen to my words. Well, obviously, these are normative dilemmas, where the words don't produce the effect that they say if you read them in text. And all of it is relational. And we now, my understanding of the way I would like to see the literature move is to turn this into something that is analytically coherent and to clarify some of these debates and divisions between camps. Also, you mentioned the Welsh school, which was the one attempt to bring normative insights. I think it will make securitization as a field more rigorous, and we bring in the disciplinary insights. This one of these projects of insights and crisis management and framing, but something else that brings psychology. With David, we're looking at nationalism studies. It talks about the same thing, so his talk later will carry on this side of the conversation.
interdisciplinary science, rigorous methodologies, clarity in concepts, in my opinion, and also being able to compare across cases rather than take one individual case. And across time, I believe that we will be able to find how the sausage is made, and therefore be empowered as citizens and as societies to decide whether to eat it or not. And I think that can have an emancipatory outcome. But of course, my article might be rejected. And then we'll be the only audience that ever hears about this one.
Yes, I had a question in relation to the effective polarization and bottom-up securitization. Is this model right now only applied to the US?
Well, it's now going crazy. It's come to Europe since last year.
Okay.
So I went to the European Political Science Association conference last week. So until when I did it, I have a link in the presentation to a webinar I did last year. This webinar I also talked to the leaders of Greek parties about. So I actually told them what they have to do when they connected to electoral prospects. And I told the Conservatives that there is no longer an electoral incentive to be anti-immigration because there was a pro-immigration affective polarization. Anyway, so affective polarization now has entered the European kind of market. In the European Political Science Association, there was about 8 panels all on affective polarization. Out of the blue, this concept is going to be the new populism. So it's worth knowing about it. And the connection with securitization has not been made. And if I ever find the time to write the article that I presented last year, or any other articles, I've mentioned a few other things, I will try to make the connection with securitization.
Later I will ask you for some ratings.
Yes, as in the PowerPoint, I will tell you there is a link to a webinar that gives you.
Okay.
Yes.
Given securitization represents a socially constructed phenomenon centered around the perception of threats, its potential for expansiveness becomes evident, allowing virtually any subject to be securitized. Consequently, when engaged in its scholarly exploration, the pertinent challenge, in my opinion, lies in effectively delineating the boundaries that define the scope of this field of study. So how can we distinctly demarcate the conceptual boundaries of securitization, and how might we operationalize this concept? Since it is about perceptions, and you have also presented public opinion surveys regarding the securitization of migration and securitization of pandemic, the question came to my mind, are there any alternative methodologies that are available to operationalize securitization beyond the realm of public opinion surveys? And considering that public opinion surveys primarily serve as the state individual level measures, do we have correspondent measurements at state level to capture the extent of securitization concerning, for instance, migration or pandemic or any other issue?
Yeah, thank you. I'll start with the second bit about the methodology. Yes, there are plenty of methodologies. The moment that you open up the methodological toolkit, you suddenly find out you can do a huge amount of things just by drawing on other literatures, in established methodologies, in crisis management there are established methodologies, in political behavior there are established methodologies, and also in public policy, for instance, when we talk about programmatic and political success, what actually happens to those securitizing actions. There are positive methodologies that you can implement there, where you can actually also bring evidence, data, real facts about what is going on in relation to the issue or how effective the measure is. These things are available and we should be using them depending on the objectives of the individual project. Some project might only be interested in the supply of arguments. You can do critical response analysis, market analysis, or anything, and find out the supply. That's a very interesting project. If you're interested on the success of it or the audience responses, then you would need to bring something else. You could study the political behavior of audiences. Survey evidence or experiments might help us understand the mechanics of securitization, which I'm personally very interested in because I'm interested in persuasion, and I think that's also marketable by itself of civil society and the political organization. but also you can observe the responses to securitization contests in life, public protest, public opinion, how it moves, often as waves and collectively. And so there is layered methodologies that can, there are multiple methodologies that can be brought into this literature by mainly going on other interdisciplinary insights. What was your first question, first part?
It was about, I was asking because very, like the challenge is...
Oh yeah, so you're asking about drawing the line to yeah, anything can potentially be securitized. I know that that might scare the criticism of the command school propensity that if everything is security, nothing is security. If everything is white, there is no black. So you need that. If everything is self, there is no other. Well, but then there is no self. What's going on? So that you need us and them. What you don't need is us versus them. But the Common School does try to limit that. Doesn't go all the way to the World School or human security, and they do that by saying, all right, it has to be a group that is a referent. You cannot make the individual a referent object, because then that would be exactly what you described, and also what the realists worry about, reductionism. Everything is security, the concept of use, it's in analytical coherence and practical use, and it's impossible to prioritize. Because you can see, if everything is top security priority, you cannot do anything. How do you allocate resources? You can deal with it. So that's why I see securitization as a contest. And it's the outcomes of this contest we observe in social realities. I don't know in advance whether something is a major, whether something will be dealt with as a major threat or not. It might be or might not be, and I would like some scientists or others to give me objective facts. But in my world, I deal with social facts. And social facts are often distorted because we have cognitive biases and we're influenced by training and our attempt to be rational is usually unsuccessful.
Thank you. I think I have to stop here because now it's the lunch break, but we will have time for other questions for Georgios also during the roundtable later on. And David. So again, a big round of applause to Georgios. It was a great. Thank you. I was sorry I didn't lecture, and I confirm a new lecture really good. I forgot, please, also to introduce you to Elizabeth Roche, who is, she was not here yesterday, but she's giving a great help with summer school, and you might have interacted with her before. She might come to you for some interviews. Anyway, thanks to Elizabeth for her help. So now we're going to have the lunch, which is just here again, and we will start again at 2 o'clock. Let me just give you another piece of information. I already started this, but since you guys mentioned some of the readings, you say you're going to put the PowerPoint available again, also for Desiree and Asia and Eul, since you were not yesterday. We're going to put also the PowerPoint. The readings are in this folder. You got the link to access the folder. Just remember, download everything, because after the summer school, this folder will not be accessible anymore. So also we'll put, as soon as we send the PowerPoint.
We can also share the unpublished article.
Yeah,
we call it Securitization Success, a new analytical framework, and then you were talking about the Bible. So this is going to be the New Testament.
Okay, so you will then need to share this New Testament with you, or only
excellent program.
So I'm going to lock the door, so if you can leave everything here, don't worry, because you can go take the food, you can go in the garden. We just started at 2 o'clock, we will start again. So please come back here at 5 o'clock.